Most people picture the original covenant with Abraham as a straightforward real estate transaction. God points to a map of the ancient Middle East and guarantees a specific stretch of territory for a wandering patriarch and his descendants. But Stephen's speech in the book of Acts highlights a strange historical footnote. Abraham stood directly in the middle of that exact territory, listening to God say everything north, east, south, and west would belong to him. Yet God gave him absolutely zero inheritance during his lifetime. The man considered the father of faith lived and died as a nomad. He never held the title to a single square foot of the ground he was promised. He didn't dispute this delay because he understood the actual scope of the agreement. Romans chapter 4 clarifies that Abraham was never meant to be the heir of Canaan. He was meant to be the heir of the entire world. Abraham's lifelong status as a nomad revealed the true scale of the gift. The inheritance he was waiting for was never limited to a few acres of territory. It was intended to span the entire globe and reach beyond his own death. 2 Peter specifies exactly what that territory is: a completely renewed earth, where righteousness exists as a permanent atmosphere. This creates a massive logistical problem. A flawless environment demands inhabitants who actually match it. You cannot inhabit a perfectly righteous world unless you possess a flawlessly righteous nature yourself. Even then, the territory and the character to live in it were secondary. In Genesis 15, before the land or the descendants were even mentioned, God told Abraham, "I am your exceeding great reward." The physical universe, entirely renewed, is simply the setting for that central gift. We face an obvious dilemma. Human willpower is incapable of generating the required perfection to enter that setting. You cannot legislate yourself into love, and you cannot replicate the exact character of God. Since a gift must be entirely free to remain a gift, the righteousness required to enter this world must also be provided by the giver. This is why the New Testament points to the righteousness of Christ, a perfect standing credited to the individual rather than being something they have to produce themselves. The original promise delivered to Abraham was a complete, all-inclusive package. It contained the land, the perfection required to live there, and God himself, all offered entirely independent of human performance. In Galatians 3, Paul argues the Abrahamic covenant was a unilateral promise, not a contract. A promise is a one-way guarantee. Exactly 430 years later, the law arrived at Mount Sinai. But a new law cannot retroactively attach conditions to an already ratified promise. Adding a "do this and you will receive" clause would make the inheritance something earned. Even if it were only partially earned, the promise would immediately cease to be a free gift. The law introduced at Sinai was never intended to provide a path to righteousness. Its purpose was to rigorously expose that humanity had none. The Old Covenant standards demonstrated the absolute futility of anyone pledging their own self-effort to meet divine requirements. The function of the law was to shatter the illusion of self-reliance. It forces the individual to look away from their own abilities and point directly to Christ, who is the only one capable of fulfilling the unconditional promise. Paul uses the allegory of two women, Hagar and Sarah, to move this theory into reality. In Galatians 4, he shifts the Old and New Covenants into internal spiritual postures. The Old Covenant, represented by Hagar, is the posture of a person pledging their own hard work to earn divine favor. Relying on what we can produce leads inevitably to spiritual slavery. The gap between rigid external rules and internal human inability is too wide, and no amount of straining can close it. The New Covenant, represented by Sarah, is the exact opposite posture. It is pure faith, recognizing that the inheritance can only be received as an unearned gift. True spiritual freedom does not come from successfully meeting performance metrics. It comes from completely removing the anxiety of having to earn God's favor. But this raises a common objection. If you remove the contract and offer this massive inheritance completely free of charge, doesn't that guarantee lawlessness? The framework described by Jeremiah and Hebrews keeps the law intact while changing its position. This stone tablet shows characters carved directly into rock. Under the New Covenant, the law moves from being a set of inflexible rules held externally on a surface like this to being written directly onto the human heart and mind. Under this new framework, disobedience occurs when a person retreats back into unbelief, returning to the anxiety of a contract mindset and trying to generate through effort what can only be received through faith. When a person truly grasps the staggering scale of this free gift and the immense cost paid to secure it, the natural response is not apathy. It is a profound obedience that flows effortlessly, like a tree producing fruit, driven entirely by awe and gratitude.